When he speaks, it's less about reacting to what's already happened and more about outlining what could happen next, and how those possibilities are being actively shaped. For fans, that adds a new layer to the experience. It shifts the focus from simply watching fights to understanding how those fights come together, why certain matchups are prioritized, and what long-term vision is guiding those choices. Because in today's boxing landscape, the future of the sport isn't just being decided in the ring. It's also being built behind the scenes, by the people shaping what the ring represents. One of the ideas that keeps coming up when people talk about Turki Alalshikh's influence is the push to make the biggest fights possible, and on the surface, that sounds simple, almost obvious. Of course fans want the biggest fights. Of course the sport benefits when top names face each other. But once you look beyond that surface, it becomes clear very quickly that this isn't just a matter of intention, it's a complex process filled with moving parts that don't always align naturally. Because in boxing, making a major fight isn't just about two fighters agreeing to step into the ring. It involves promoters, networks, managers, sanctioning bodies, financial structures, broadcast rights, venue logistics, each with their own priorities, expectations, and limitations. And more often than not, those interests don't line up easily. That's why so many dream matchups in boxing history have either been delayed or never happened at all. This is where Alalshikh's role starts to stand out in a meaningful way. It's not just about wanting big fights, it's about creating the conditions where they can actually happen. That means coordinating across multiple sides, finding common ground where there initially may be none, and building a framework where all parties see value in moving forward. When conversations about the future of boxing start to build, they usually center on the fighters, the champions, the contenders, the dream matchups everyone wants to see. But that's only part of the picture. More recently, there's been a noticeable shift in how people understand the sport, with growing attention being placed on the figures operating behind the scenes, the ones who aren't throwing punches, but are making decisions that shape which punches get thrown, when, and on what stage. And among those figures, Turki Alalshikh has quickly become one of the most influential names driving that conversation forward. What makes his role so impactful isn't just involvement, it's vision. While many promoters and stakeholders focus on individual events or short-term success, his approach appears to stretch far beyond that, looking at boxing as a global product that can be reorganized, elevated, and presented in a way that reaches wider audiences. It's not just about making fights happen, it's about how they happen, how they're positioned, and how they fit into a bigger, more connected structure that keeps fans consistently engaged. That broader perspective is what separates routine decision-making from something more transformative. Instead of treating fights as isolated moments, there's an effort to build continuity, to create narratives, stack cards, and align matchups in a way that feels intentional rather than fragmented. And in a sport that has often struggled with consistency and missed opportunities, that kind of structured thinking stands out. This is why his interviews carry a different kind of weight. They're not just promotional appearances or surface-level commentary, they offer insight into the thinking behind the scenes, into how decisions are being made and what direction the sport might be heading in. It requires influence, resources, and perhaps most importantly, a willingness to approach the sport from a broader perspective rather than a narrow, event-by-event mindset. What makes this approach different is the focus on removing barriers rather than working around them. Instead of accepting that certain fights are too difficult to make, the effort shifts towards solving those difficulties. Whether that's through financial incentives, strategic partnerships, or restructuring how events are organized and presented. It's about turning possibilities into realities, even when the path isn't straightforward. And when that works, the impact is immediate. Fights that once felt unlikely suddenly become real. Matchups that fans had written off start to take shape. The conversation around the sport changes, from frustration about what isn't happening to excitement about what finally is. That's why this emphasis matters. Because making the biggest fights possible isn't just a slogan, it's a challenge. One that requires coordination, persistence, and a level of influence that goes beyond the usual boundaries of the sport. And when someone is able to bring all those elements together, it doesn't just create big fights, it changes what fans believe is possible. At the same time, there's a very deliberate push not just to serve the existing boxing audience, but to expand it. And that's where things get tricky in a way people often underestimate. Because bringing new fans into the sport isn't just about visibility or bigger events, it's about making boxing feel accessible, understandable, and engaging to people who don't already live and breathe it. And doing that without alienating longtime fans? That's a balancing act that has tripped up the sport more than once. On one side, you have the core audience, the fans who understand the nuances, who appreciate the technical battles, the strategy, the history behind certain matchups. They don't just want big fights, they want meaningful fights, fights that make sense within the sport's structure. On the other side, you have potential new viewers, people who might be drawn in by spectacle, storytelling, or major events, but who aren't yet connected to the deeper layers of boxing. The challenge is clear. How do you satisfy both without compromising either? That's where this broader approach becomes important. It's not about simplifying boxing to the point where it loses its identity, it's about presenting it differently. Making big fights feel like global events, building narratives that are easy to follow, creating moments that capture attention beyond the usual fanbase, while still preserving the competitive integrity that longtime followers care about. And when that balance is right, the effect is powerful. New fans come in because the sport feels exciting and accessible. Existing fans stay engaged because the matchups still matter, the stakes are still real, and the quality hasn't been sacrificed for attention. Instead of choosing one audience over the other, the goal becomes connecting both, creating an experience that works on multiple levels at the same time. This is why the conversation around boxing's future keeps coming back to this idea. Because growth without authenticity doesn't last. And authenticity without growth limits what the sport can become. Finding that middle ground isn't easy, but when it's done right, it doesn't just grow the audience. It strengthens the sport itself. Another key part of his vision goes beyond just which fights happen, it's about how those fights are experienced. Because in today's landscape, a great matchup alone isn't always enough to create a lasting impact. What separates a good event from a truly memorable one is everything built around it, the atmosphere, the presentation, the feeling that what you're watching isn't just another night of boxing, but something bigger, something that actually matters. That's where the idea of creating significant events comes in. It starts with production, the visuals, the pacing, the way the broadcast draws you in from the very beginning. The lighting, the walkouts, the camera work, the sound, every detail contributes to the sense that this isn't ordinary. Then there's promotion, which shapes how fans perceive the fight before it even happens. It's about building anticipation, telling the story, making people feel like they can't miss what's coming. But more importantly, it's how all of that comes together on the night itself. When done right, the event feels complete. The fights, the presentation, the energy, they all align to create an experience that stays with the audience even after it's over. Whether someone is sitting ringside or watching from home, there's a sense that they've witnessed something meaningful, not just in terms of the result, but in the way it was delivered. And that's what makes this approach stand out. Because it recognizes that boxing isn't just a sport, it's also a spectacle. Not in a way that replaces the competition, but in a way that elevates it. The goal isn't to distract from the fights, but to enhance them, to frame them in a way that amplifies their importance and makes them feel like moments rather than just matchups. When that level of detail is consistently applied, something interesting happens. Fans don't just remember who won or lost. They remember how it felt to watch it. The role of collaboration sits right at the center of this entire approach, and without it, most of these big ideas simply don't materialize. Because boxing, by nature, has always been fragmented. Different promoters, different networks, different interests, all operating within their own spaces, often protecting their own priorities. That's why so many potential superfights have historically stalled or fallen apart. Not because they couldn't happen, but because getting everyone on the same page proved too difficult. So when you start talking about consistently making major fights, collaboration stops being optional, it becomes essential. And not just surface-level cooperation, but real coordination. The kind that requires promoters to work together instead of against each other, fighters to align on timing and opportunity, organizations to find common ground despite competing interests. That's not standard practice in boxing, that's a shift in how the sport operates at a fundamental level. What makes this particularly significant is what it unlocks. Fights that once seemed unrealistic because of promotional barriers, contractual complications, or conflicting agendas suddenly become possible when there's a framework built around shared goals. Instead of asking, "Why can't this happen?" the conversation starts to change to, "How do we make this happen?" And that shift in mindset is where real progress begins. Of course, it's not simple. Collaboration at this scale requires constant communication, negotiation, and a willingness from all sides to compromise in areas they normally wouldn't. It requires trust, or at least a mutual understanding that the end result benefits everyone involved: the fighters, the promoters, and most importantly, the fans. But when it works, the impact is undeniable. Because what you get isn't just a single event. You get a model. A way of doing things that proves big fights don't have to stay stuck in the what-if category. They can be built, organized, and delivered when the right people are willing to work together, and that's why collaboration matters so much here, because in a sport where division has often been the norm, bringing people together doesn't just create fights, it changes what the sport is capable of becoming. From a broader perspective, what all of these efforts are really doing is slowly reshaping how boxing is seen, not just by hardcore fans, but by the global audience as a whole. For a long time, the sport has carried a reputation of being fragmented, sometimes difficult to follow, and occasionally inaccessible to casual viewers. But with a more coordinated, event-driven, and globally minded approach, that perception is starting to shift towards something more unified, more engaging, and far easier to connect with. This shift isn't happening overnight, and it's not just about bigger fights, it's about how the sport is presented and experienced. Accessibility plays a huge role in that. Making events easier to watch, easier to understand, and easier to follow from one fight to the next helps bring in new audiences who might have previously felt disconnected. At the same time, maintaining a consistent level of quality and significance keeps existing fans invested, giving them something that feels structured rather than scattered. Engagement is another key part of this transformation. It's no longer just about what happens in the ring. It's about the full experience surrounding it. The storytelling, the promotion, the build-up, the global conversation, these elements create a sense that boxing is part of a larger cultural moment, not just an isolated sporting event. And when that engagement is sustained, it builds momentum that carries from one event to the next. Then there's the global reach. Boxing has always been an international sport, but this approach pushes that even further, treating it as a truly global product, where events can resonate across different regions, cultures, and audiences at the same time. That kind of reach doesn't just expand viewership, it strengthens the sport's position on a worldwide scale, making it more relevant, more visible, and more competitive in a crowded entertainment landscape. And that's where the long-term impact really comes into focus. Because this isn't just about improving the current moment, it's about setting a foundation for what boxing can become in the future. A sport that is easier to follow, more consistent in delivering big moments, and more connected to a global audience than ever before. If that direction continues, it won't just change how boxing looks today. It will shape how it grows, evolves, and is experienced for years to come. At the same time, pushing for this kind of transformation isn't as smooth as it might sound, because whenever a sport starts to change its structure, its presentation, and the way it operates behind the scenes, it naturally creates a level of uncertainty that can't be ignored. Boxing, in particular, has long been built on established systems, familiar patterns, and independent power structures, so any effort to reshape that landscape is bound to face resistance, complications, and moments where the direction forward isn't entirely clear. And that's where the real challenge lies. Because change, even when it's aimed at improvement, can disrupt what already exists. Fighters may need to adjust to new expectations, promoters may have to rethink their strategies, and organizations may find themselves navigating a different kind of competitive environment. For fans, too, the shift can feel unfamiliar at first, especially for those who are used to the traditional rhythm of how boxing has operated for years. This is why not every change automatically leads to progress. Without careful planning, even well-intentioned efforts can create imbalance, whether that's in matchmaking, scheduling, or how opportunities are distributed across the sport. There's always a risk that in trying to move forward quickly, certain elements that made boxing compelling in the first place could be overlooked or diluted. That's exactly why strategic planning becomes so critical. It's not just about having a vision. It's about managing how that vision is implemented. Knowing when to push forward and when to adjust. Balancing innovation with tradition. Making sure that while the sport evolves, it doesn't lose the authenticity and competitive integrity that define it. And perhaps most importantly, it's about sustainability. Because real transformation isn't measured by one successful event or a short run of big fights. It's measured by whether the system can hold together over time, whether it continues to deliver value for fighters, fans, and everyone involved in the long run.